Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome.
Science is powerful, but more than powerful is needed. In the NASA archives, there is a spectacular picture. It's dark and grainy, but you can just about make out what you're looking at. It shows an American astronaut with a Russian cosmonaut sharing a handshake. But this is no ordinary handshake. The two men are floating in zero gravity, reaching across the hatch from an American spaceship to a Russian one, grasping their hands and turning their faces to smile at the camera. This was the first ever rendezvous between a Soviet and a United States ship in space. It was the year of 1975. Given the circumstances, the photographer can be actually forgiven for an image that is not that clear. Yet the image radiates a huge sense of importance. Glancing at it, the significance of the moment that is easy to understand. Today, what I wanted to do was basically to talk about one of the men that was there in the picture, Alexei Leonov, the first human being to step out of a spacecraft and walk in the space. This handshake was not the last you would hear of Leonov, because this was to be an enduring relationship and friendship. In 2004, Leonov got into another unknown business. He became a writer, and he co-authored a dual biography of the space race with former American astronaut David Scott. Leonov was clear that one of the most competitive races in history could be seen as part of our collective history as a species. Not really from the Soviet point of view or from the American perspective, but from the human perspective. I met Alexei Leonov for the first time just a few months ago. And the first time he spoke, I was so captivated by his experiences. And I was captivated by his determination not to let the national flag on his spacesuit get in the way of scientific progress for humanity. At a time when the idea of global research didn't exist, Leonov crossed the hatch to shake hands with another man that came from a country that was a rival. And he continued to do so through his life. The spirit of Alexei Leonov's work is what I want to talk about today. First, about science diplomacy, using science as building bridges for the future. And second, about open science, about this idea of openness to the world, which by definition is so important for building peace. So first, I believe science diplomacy is very powerful and often overlooked on the world stage. At the height of the Cold War, when Alexei Leonov was taking part of his first step into space, everything was a competition between the US and the Soviet Union. From chess to proxy wars, cooperation was non-existent, even treason. But by the 80s, 10 agreements of science cooperation were signed between the two powers. More than 20 scientific papers and workshops were held, and hundreds of scientific people took place and exchanged information, spending time working directly with and for the enemy, quote unquote. So why did this happen? Why it was like that? It happened, I think, because science is universal. It does not care about if it's capitalism or communism or religious creed. Science does not take sides, but it can improve the lives of many, no matter what they believe. Later today, we will be here together to sign PRIMA. For me, the most important science diplomacy project of my tenure as a commissioner. And so I wanted to acknowledge that small steps that can get us to big places. It has really successfully crystallized the Euromed cooperation by working on two of the region's biggest challenges: water scarcity and food insecurity. Today's ceremony will bear testimony of that. Examples like PRIMA are not often there. They are examples that show us that science can sometimes be the best tool for diplomacy. Politics is very difficult to separate from other things. Even sport is one country versus another. But science can unite even desperate enemies for a common purpose. I remember the words of Sir Joseph Banks, the British naturalist, that was in contact with Benjamin Franklin all the time. And even after Franklin signed the Declaration of Independence, making him an enemy of the United Kingdom, Sir Joseph said, and I quote, "The science of two nations may be at peace while their politics are at war." So fast forward to today. Where are we? We're just here. 100 kilometers north of this great city is a country in the grips of war. The worst war in a generation. And not even 100 kilometers west is a conflict that has divided the world. A conflict that we want all to see solved, and where I believe science can play its part. I cannot be here and not talk about Sesame, Jordan's greatest project of science diplomacy. Some members of Sesame have territorial disputes. Some have fought wars, and yet here they are. I don't know where's my friend Rolf Hoyer, but he must be somewhere there. And projects like Sesame are long-term projects. They require investment, commitment, and cooperation between nations. Cooperation that opens channels of communication, that generates mutual respect and admiration, and that moves people's hearts as well as their minds. So I'm looking forward to hearing the perspective of Dr. Gihan Kamel in the science diplomacy panel just afterwards. Because Dr. Kamel is one of those examples. Dr. Kamel once said that to tackle the great problems that we face as a species, we need to overcome our differences. We need to keep breaking borders, breaking rules, breaking everything that we can to get to the point that it's pure logic, that we can unify nationalities, religions, cultures, and genders. The EU has imposed sanctions on Russia, and Russia retaliated in kind, but we have maintained a dialogue that I'm very proud of through research and innovation. Russia is still a welcome partner of Horizon 2020, our European program for science. And we're even launching joint research funding with Russia on TB and HIV. We want to maintain this bridge, a precious link through the common language of science. And I said, and I believe in science diplomacy, and I practice what I preach. And this brings me to my second point, that open science, that openness to the world, that international science should be our goal, not only because it creates a positive dialogue with other nations, but because it is the best kind of science. Earlier this month, in a very interesting article in Nature, they did something that I think we need, because we talk about open science, we talk about international science, but what's the impact of that? Where can I prove to the heads of state and heads of government that the impact is bigger? And so they got some OECD data, and they found once again that scientists that have moved between countries produce better science. That the number of citations of scientists that move international are up 20% in terms of what they do and in terms of those publications. So if you look at that chart, that actually has two axes. One, where you see the openness of a country. And what's the openness of a country? The openness of a country is if you have a lot of scientists that come in and a lot of science that go out. You receive a lot of people from other countries, and a lot of people from your country go also to other countries. So that's one of the axes. And the other one is impact. And what you see is that, and that actually makes me proud, is on the top 12 countries that have the higher openness, that actually receive the more people and send the more people to other parts of the world. And those 12 top-notch countries that have the higher impact in terms of science, those 10 are actually European. And that is something that we want to keep for the future. So cross-border science can be a very selfish goal also for us to improve our own research system, but I would go further than this. International science is also the best thing for our world. So imagine if all countries of the world were equal partners in fight against climate change. How much sooner would we have solutions? How much sooner we would solve the problem? In 2014, when I started as a commissioner for science, we had a big crisis of Ebola. And we had to get together and react very quickly, and we were able to get basically 200 million euros, 100 million euros from the Commission, and another 100 million euros from companies to actually find the first vaccine. And we did it in Europe. But you know what? If we had done it long ago, all together, we could have solved the problem. That was not the problem of one country, was the problem of all of us. So what about other big problems of our society? What about Alzheimer? What about cancer? What about HIV if we do it together? So we face problems that we cannot conquer on our own. Even the challenges that can be solved alone could be solved faster and better together. Our job must be to make science truly open to the world. There have been great advances in science diplomacy, and there is more international collaborative science than ever before. But it's not enough. We must do all we can to encourage international science, because, for me, international science means peace. In the EU, we are coming to the end of our current research program, Horizon 2020, and I want to create the new Horizon 2020 until 27. And I want to be clear that this is not just about telling stories. This is not just about telling you what I believe. We want to be concrete. So the first thing we do, and the first thing I want, is that we should support greater international mobility of scientists. We will launch 30 international flagships until 2020 with more than 1 billion euros. And that will be for mobility, because the data shows that researchers that are mobile actually have a better and bigger impact. We will have different flagships, but those flagships will be to work with you around the world. Second, we should enable more collaborative projects with non-European partners. So far, we have opened Horizon 2020 to a couple of partners, to good partners. Some of those here today, I'm sure, from Tunisia to Ukraine, to Norway, to Switzerland, to Israel. But we want to do more. We want to open it really to the world, and we want to associate more countries, because we know that together we can have a global research area that is bigger than Europe. It has to be the size of the world. And we should increase support to research innovation to address global challenges. Because without that, there's no solutions. Tell me how we're going to solve cybersecurity in the world if we don't put everyone together. Tell me how we're going to solve and tackle cancer or HIV if we don't work together. So openness is the way forward, even when some say closeness. Openness with our science, openness with results and data, openness with articles. We have to go from a paradigm where people have to pay to read articles of science. We have to go to another paradigm where people don't have to pay to read science, to text and data mine, because that's when they find the future. So openness with all of you, and openness will be the flag of Europe, as it has been always, but today more important than before. So ladies and gentlemen, this is why I admire so much Jordan, because you've shown so much openness in the midst of such a difficult conflict, and the desire to work together for all our benefit. We are neighbors, sharing one earth. We face shared problems that need us all to work together. And it's real that simple. So I hope that you will all join me today, and especially those of you on the next panel, to explore what we need to do to continue on the legacy of men like Alexei Leonov. Pasteur once said, "Science knows no country because knowledge belongs to humanity and is the torch which illuminates the world." I agree wholeheartedly with the spirit of Pasteur. I do not think that we are there yet, but we have to fight each and every day. The efforts of every single one of you to join together in this room today shows that there is a true determination to get to our destination. I hope it will continue, so count on me. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our panelists. Chief Science Advisor of the Office of the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Peter Gluckman. Director General and Chief Executive Officer of the International Institute of Applied System Analysis, Austria, Pavel Kabat. Infrared beamline scientist, Sesame Jordan, Jihan Kamil. Steering Committee Member, Inter-Academy Partnership, Daya Reddy. Assistant Director General for Natural Sciences, UNESCO, Flavia Schlegel. Executive Secretary, Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, Austria, Lesina Zerbo. And our moderator is Senior Board Director of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, USA, Vaughan Turikian.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for all of your patience and sitting through, and actually I think hopefully spending a lot of time not only making connections with each other, those people you know, but critically taking the opportunity to really get to know each other and what each other does and what each other thinks. It is really that the heart of science diplomacy is about science and people. It is my great pleasure to be joined by a wonderful panel of experts that cross many different boundaries with many different experiences that for the next hour we'll have the opportunity to really begin to delve deep into concrete actions going forward that really, I think, can help inform some science diplomacy activities. I really noticed that the commissioner did an amazing job, and since we did not talk to him today, it must have been a great example of a mind meld that takes place, as only it can in science, that the commissioner laid out so many of the topics that I hope that we can talk about today, talking about Cold War institutions, talking about Sesame, talking about the types of things that we move beyond some of the conflict, talking about the issue I think that we'll actually have a lot of conversation about, which is the issue of science diplomacy in an era of growing nationalism. And I think that's an area where many of my panelists here will have much to speak about. So in the world of the alpha and the omega of this conference, it was almost as if it was planned that my colleague, Lassina Zerbo, was sitting on this panel at the start of the week and gets to speak on this panel at the end of the week. But before I turn over with a question, I do want to just acknowledge Her Royal Highness, Princess Samaya, who has done just a magnificent job with her passion and her patience and all of the things that brought together a wonderful group of people, and critically to the people of Jordan who have hosted us so hospitably over the past week. So please, I do ask that we just recognize our wonderful hosts. So with that, I would actually like to open up with my colleague, Professor Zerba, with a question, which really is, your organization sits in a place where science and international affairs meet. What kind of experiences have you seen over the years of running this activity, the CTBTO, that can help inform some of the science diplomacy activities?
Thank you, Vaughan. And thanks for giving me the floor on the last day, even if I was to speak on the first day. But anyway, I think you've said it, this Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization, as many of the arms control treaties, are basically science-based they deal with monitoring and verification. You cannot do monitoring and verification when you don't bring the science that brings the technology that will help you to monitor compliance with the treaty that you're dealing with. And the CTBT is such a treaty. I often say that those pioneers in the end of the war, in the early 50s, who negotiated those treaties, Non-Proliferation, Chemical Weapon Convention, Biological Weapon Convention, Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, are embodied science and diplomacy for policy issues and policy decision. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty is now 21 years old, a treaty that is not in force, but a technology that is efficient and proving its worth again and again through the DPRK, the North Korean issues. Our world is bad, but science is great. That's where we're living. We live in a world that seems, uncertain, difficulties, poverty, insecurity, terrorism, and at the same time, science has been going increasingly confident and giving the tools that normally should help us to live in a safe and secure place. You mentioned the CTBT. With a treaty that is not in place, and a science and technology behind it that is solid, what we do today is to use science to get countries that are reluctant with regard to this treaty, to insert capacity and building the knowledge in the countries for them to feel confident and get the trust necessary for the policymakers to decide on the ratification of the treaty. And that's why the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty represents I would say, organization where you feel on a daily basis the role of science in policy decision. And I can go on, but I think in saving time, you've asked us to have 3 minutes. I'm doing 1.5 minutes, hoping that with questions we can take it further. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And I think that applause is well placed for respect for time. Jihan, we heard the commissioner, and I'm sure that you talked to him right beforehand and said, "I've got a great quote you should use of mine," and he massively inserted it. But the same question to you really is, from Sesame standpoint, what are some of the experiences that really speak to this issue of science diplomacy as you see it?
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak again about Sesame. That I'm sure that most of you now know what Sesame is. I also thank Commissioner Mudas for quoting my words that I really believe in. Maybe this is the reason why people always tell me that I touch their hearts when I speak about Sesame, because I believe in it. Sesame particularly is a light source. This is the technical term that describes synchrotron facility. But I believe in our case, giving this name, a light source, is not only mentioning the synchrotron radiation, it's mentioning the possibility to have light in a dark time that we live in. It's becoming like our destiny to have our dark times and difficult times, but somehow we are trying with this light source to break all the stereotypes, all the taboos that our people are keep putting for our region. And I think since we also work with radiation, that's infrared and X-rays and so on, we need another type of light. We need to see, and we need to feel each other, and we need to understand each other. This is what I got to know when I was introduced to Sesame almost 13 years ago. Sesame is, as being described, a bridge. It's bridging nations that are specifically, politically, and culturally divided. Sesame members, just to mention quickly, are Egypt, Jordan, Cyprus, Iran, Israel, Palestinian Authority, Turkey. And just showing the map of these members in any presentation, just quickly, it gives us the impression, what are these people doing together, and if really they are doing something useful. And I assure you from my place, and I take this opportunity to tell you that I have colleagues from Sesame here. I cannot see them very well, but please, I ask them to stand up and give them a hand, because without these people, we couldn't achieve what we achieved today. We represent a very small number of Sesame people. And when I say Sesame people, I don't mean only Sesame staff. I mean Sesame community. I mean everyone who's supporting Sesame. I mean everyone who's supporting science for peace. I assure you that we are using science, we're using physics and chemistry and biology, engineering, and technology. And we are bringing people together from divided nations in one place. You have to see them together in order to believe that they talk together, they work together, they accept each other. We have different nationalities, religions, cultures, but we gather around only one thing in Sesame. We gather around science. I may need an entry visa to go to Iran or Pakistan or Turkey or Cyprus or any of Sesame members, but at Sesame, I don't need entry visa. I need a collaborator, I need a colleague, and I need a friend. And this is what we established so far. Sesame took around 20 years to arrive at this stage, but I believe that this is one of our benefits, that we built a community before having an operational machine. And in my opinion, people are more important in our case than a machine. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to actually just dig very quickly into, you said you built the community before building the machine. And I was here when right before it was turned on officially. Just very quickly, when you are in Sesame, how aware or how much are you aware around your colleagues of those tensions that exist in the culture, but that you're going past them? Is that something that's unspoken? Is it spoken?
I would say that we are trying, as I said before, I always say that it's true that we are scientists and engineers in Sesame, but we're also human beings, and we cannot close our eyes of what's happening every day in the region, and we cannot ignore our breaking news every day. But somehow we decide to put these things aside in order to make something positive out of all this negativity around. And we do not talk about politics, but it doesn't mean that we don't care. It doesn't mean that we don't feel. It just means that we are trying to create a new way, a new passage, a new source of light, just hoping to produce something our diplomats and our politicians couldn't manage to do it so far.
Thank you. Peter, I'm going to go down to you because you've been involved in a lot of international networks, and particularly now with INCSA as one of the networks and thinking about advisory systems as a whole. In your experience with that and other things, what do you see as some of the things that could be instructive to groups that are thinking about science and building diplomacy and science together?
Well, I think we need to start with understanding that the main unit of diplomacy is still the nation state. In the end of the day, it's nation states that undertake diplomacy. And if you think about, so I'm going to take a rather utilitarian perspective, because that's how nation states look at it. We have two overlapping domains. One of international science, which is generally run by ministries of science to advance knowledge, and one of using science as a tool of diplomacy, which is generally run by foreign ministries and ministries of science, and prime ministers' offices or presidential offices. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is an increasing need to intertwine those and integrate those, and then present the arguments for why it matters to our governments. And it matters at three different levels. Diplomacy is always about national interest. But the first level is when it's of direct national interest. And for example, for New Zealand, a little country, our national interest is most protected by reminding people that we exist, that our existential risk is being forgotten. And so by being a good contributor to the global world of science, we are reminding people of our existence. Then at the second level, there are regional issues, bilateral issues, managing fish stocks with Australia and our Pacific Island neighbours, thinking about the marine protected areas in our region, thinking about how do we deliver development assistance to the Pacific Island nations that we have an interest in. That's regional interest, but science and science diplomacy play a critical role in it. And then finally, it is how do we persuade our governments to deal with the issues of global interest? How do we make them understand enlightened self-interest is global interest? And for example, in the case of New Zealand, where we have a great interest in the Antarctic, it's been a remarkable success, the Antarctic Treaty, as a source of here is the white continent, which is only used for peaceful purposes, for the purposes of science, and is effectively governed by science. And New Zealand is a core member of that. Another example is the Global Research Alliance to reduce agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. 20% of greenhouse gas emissions come from food production. New Zealand is a country which, in the developed world, has the largest percentage of its emissions coming from agriculture. We have led the world in developing a research alliance to try and address that because of both because of a global interest, but because of our self-interest. We need to see our own emissions reduced. We need global cooperation to achieve that. And while that sounds like a very utilitarian and selfish way of thinking about science diplomacy, it's from that conversation that governments work together better to promote social diplomacy through science at the global level. I'll stop there.
Daya, you've now been involved in a few different networks, including some now, I'd say, one-time nascent networks now that are going forward, and also through your experience with the Inter-Academy Partnership. Same question to you, actually. What have you seen in terms of what's experiences in those networks coming together that actually speaks to a science diplomacy piece going forward?
Thanks very much, Vaughan. I'd like to respond to your question by saying just a few words about not only the Inter-Academy Partnership, but also the International Council for Science, both of which, of course, are World Science Forum partners. And then I want to describe some initiatives, recent developments, which I think serve as lessons for all of us with regard to how exactly we should be considering how best to promote our convening power, how best we should give substance to this idea of collaboration. So the Inter-Academy Partnership comprises some 130 academies of science and medicine. Its main objective really is that of strengthening academies not only in the countries in which it finds its membership, but also beyond, with a view, for example, to putting them in a position in which they are able to provide science advice to policymakers. Also, it's involved very much in promoting scientific literacy in the global citizenry. A few words about the International Council for Science, which also has a global reach, but which is probably unique in that its membership comprises national members as well as some 32 disciplinary scientific unions, international scientific unions. So it can use its convening power, its mobilization power with regard not only to national members but also to these scientific unions in addressing issues that, for example, relate to both policy for science and science for policy, and then very importantly, issues around the universality of science, that is, the principle and the practice of freedom and responsibility in science. So those are just a few words on those two organizations. The first of the two developments that I want to comment on are, first of all, the fact that, well, all right, they are global, there is much collaboration that goes on within them, but they have realized the need for collaboration amongst themselves together with other global organizations. So, for example, under an umbrella by the name of Science International, both of these organizations, together with the International Social Science Council and the World Academy of Sciences, all of whom, by the way, are forum partners, have agreed to come together in a series of probably annual engagements and programs around matters particularly that relate to policy for science. The first program, which concluded, I guess will conclude this year, relates to a topic that we had some discussion of in the session yesterday on the digital revolution. So that's got to do with data, the openness or the principle of openness of data, access to it, and the guidelines that would be relevant to policymakers, but also universities, libraries, and the like. The next project or program will relate to refugee scientists who are displaced. And again, the question as to what these organizations can do with regard to informing policymakers and also universities and other professionals in order to ease the way for such professionals to become engaged in science, notwithstanding the precarious situations in which they find themselves. Perhaps I'll stop at that point and say more later.
No, because I actually want to, I was just thinking about what Peter said earlier about the different sort of cataloging of science diplomacy, and particularly with the inter-academy partnership, that you're talking about national academies. So almost the domestic, the national advisory mechanisms. Bringing those together, those national academies to think at the international scale. Can you, with the 25 seconds that are clicking down, give us sort of an idea of how that has affected even the science, to bring that together around science diplomacy and dealing with the global issues that Peter mentioned?
Well, what I omitted to mention was the fact that, correct, we have national academies which have largely national problems and challenges at heart, but an essential component of the inter-academy partnership is the set of regional networks. So we know about ESAC, another forum partner, but also we have networks for Africa and for Latin America and for Asia. Sorry, not Latin, the Americas, I should say, and for Asia. So one has, if you like, a layering of activities at the national level, at the regional level, and at the global level. And the activities take place at the different levels, which is absolutely key, given that I think we all realize within our national academies that by and large, except for rather narrowly defined problems, we are not able to address these problems on our own.
I hope in the second round we can actually dig into this a little bit deeper, particularly as it relates to the issue of around nationalism and how we think about the rise of nationalism, as the commissioner alluded to early in his speech. Pavel, you've had an organization that's been around and watched and witnessed the Cold War come and go in science, and that. What are some of the experiences that you've seen in that sort of are instructive to a group here? I think you have some slides.
Can we see the slides? Well, let me, before they fix the slide, let me say.
Your slides are up there.
Yeah, let me say how incredibly important, symbolic, emotional it is for me to sit here next to my colleague from Sesame after her initial words, which were so eloquently expressing what we both are trying to do. YASA and Sesame together. Thank you very much for that. What do you need to get there, to get to Sesame or to YASA? You need three things when the world is difficult. You need leadership, vision, and courage. These all three came from great leaders of this world in the 70s, of two big blocks at that time, where the divide was just black and white, East and West. Former US President Lyndon Johnson and former Premier of USSR, Alexei Kosygin. They met in 1967 in Glassboro. This is a picture, as they started to discuss bridges. And one of the bridges they put up was a science. Why not to use science to build the understanding among divided and dangerous world of 70s. The worlds which they spoke to each other was, despite of the divide, which was Berlin Wall divide, why don't we put together the best scientists from both sides of the wall to work on the problems which are too complex and big for one single discipline, one single institution, one single nation, and one single geo-economic political bloc. This is how YASA was founded in 1972 by 12 founding member countries, and this is a historical picture from Royal Society when that happened. Convinced that science and technology, if wisely directed, can benefit all mankind, believing that international cooperation between national institutes promotes cooperation between nations and so the economic and social progress of peoples. Hereby resolve to establish International Institute of Applied System Analysis. This is from the YASA Charter signed by 12 countries in 1972. Current IASA has 24, and next month 25 member countries, when Israel will join us. It is a truly global, international, independent science institute. 450 international staff from 50 countries share the same feeling, like my colleague from Sesame said, feeling of working together on the meaningful progress, meaningful transition to the better world. Around 3,000 affiliated scholars and science diplomats worldwide, 650 partner institutions worldwide, and 2,000 visitors coming to Luxembourg, host country Austria, every year from both science and science diplomacy. Does this work? My answer is, it does. It's meaningful contribution to the world discourse. I could go a whole afternoon about the successes which this fantastic project of two world leaders brought about. Do we need more? Is it needed now? In 1992, when Mr. Gorbachev started his perestroika in the Soviet Union, of course there were questions about, do we need this science diplomacy project anymore? At that time, there were voices that we might not need it anymore. Again, two visionaries at that time, President Bill Clinton and Chancellor Vranitzky from Austria, decided to prolong the institution to become global. When I travel the world, I'm showing one more picture, which I don't show you here, showing the current divides, which are multiple, which are concerned with equality, with digital divide, with education divide. And unfortunately, we seem to be back to the geopolitical divide of the 70s as well. My position is that dialogue like here, our two institutions, IASA and Sesame, are providing meaningful contribution. We hope to be useful for the future in the building of bridges which we need through science. I will come later to the proposition I am having to the regions of the world we are now part of here in the Middle East. I believe that the current world needs science, science which is not compromised by politics, independent, but at the same time open-minded for international collaboration.
Thank you. Well, Flavia, you represent an organization that came from the ashes of a war that the Commissioner mentioned also in his remarks, and is now turning 71 years old in the next few days, I guess. What experiences do you see from the formation, the history, the operation around science diplomacy?
Well, thank you, Juan, and it's 72 years now. Yeah, it was founded in 1945, and I think it was probably the first science diplomacy, soft power enterprise ever, or maybe not ever, but at a time where nobody really talked about science diplomacy yet, or soft power. As you said, it was on the ruins of World War II, which we see many ruins around this region as well, where actually national states, because Peter mentioned that, sat together and were looking into where are actually concrete topics where we want to talk to each other, where we do realize that we actually all want to send our children to good schools or have a good healthcare system. And I think this is really what brought this common shared interest was found. And I think this was really also a diplomacy issue because it had to be negotiated. I think it really requires a long-term commitment, 72 years. I mean, there were very many setbacks in UNESCO as well, but there were very many successes coming out of that agreement 72 years ago. When you think about CERN, which was created in UNESCO, and then, if I may say, Sesame as a spin-off of CERN and UNESCO. Also, the concept of copyright, for example, was created at UNESCO. But what I really think is very important that these science diplomacy initiatives have sort of like a concrete relevance. And may I have the slide, this slide, which you might see soon. Yes, somebody could also. So I go here. Yes, we got it now. So I think science diplomacy has to make sense. And when you look now, this are the transboundary aquifers in the Arab region. This is a UNESCO and partners world map on all the aquifers, and you see here a rendered version of the region here. And you see that these darker brown dots, they are actually not really the same as the national borders. These are the aquifers which we cannot see. They are invisible underground. Now, what's the diplomacy behind here? I mean, you have to all these states agree that you can go there and collect data. You need the diplomacy that you can actually then compare the data. And you need the science to go there, collect, and to compare the data and come up with this map. But how do you convince them all? I think because it is a shared resource, so governments do at some point in time understand that they have to know better where their water resources are, and in this region most of the water resources are actually underground. And as the image shows, these water resources are shared. So it's not just one member state, again, the national state here, as Peter alluded to, it's not just one state which can actually manage those water resources. This has to be shared. So I think it's very important that once in a while, these science diplomacy initiatives, enterprises, like with this great institution, Sesame, really have a concrete impact, but also have an added value to all stakeholders involved, to the politicians, because they know better now where their resources are, but also the scientists, because they can cooperate with each other. But I think this is also the topic here of this World Science Forum, it does actually have to make a difference also then for the local populations. And I think this is what is really cross-cutting when you look at the programs, at the science programs of UNESCO, that they should bring benefits actually to all stakeholders involved.
So Flavia, this is a time where we're seeing an increase in nationalism, I think, in many parts of the world. In fact, maybe even in all. Obviously, in our country, we've gone through an election. A number of countries have seen this. You speak about UNESCO, and by the way, it looks wonderful for 72. It doesn't look a day older than 71. Could you create a UNESCO today in this environment, or was there something special or something that was bringing people together around a common purpose, given what the world had seen, that allowed for a UNESCO to be created? Would you create a UNESCO today?
Well, would I create a UNESCO today? I think a UNESCO is as relevant today as it was 72 years ago. And I mean, obviously we have member states who have left recently UNESCO or are considering leaving UNESCO. I don't think that makes UNESCO less relevant. I mean, obviously it just responds to a changing political environment. And I think it's very important that remaining member states do engage courageously, proactively in the promotion of the values of an organization like UNESCO. And I think many of us here on this podium, but also the colleagues out there, the friends out there, do actually share. I mean, I think particularly for the scientists, and I mean, at the same time as we're sitting here, we also have colleagues of ours sitting in Bonn at COP23, climate change. I mean, really the one big topic now, which many politicians, I would say, and also many scientists are still out there denying climate change. And I think it's absolutely crucial that we speak up, that we have good arguments, not angry, not unpolite, but I think passionate and convincing. It's absolutely important that we're not intimidated by 140 letters, Twitter messages, sometimes sent in the middle of the night. I think we really have to make sure that we make a concrete, good, convincing argument, and which does not only convince the politician, but also the constituency, where we can really reach out. And I think this is probably also one objective of this World Science Forum. We have to reach out to the people, to the one who, if they have the opportunity to elect the president, that these people are actually also informed. And I think this is also so great, and I'd like to thank also Her Royal Highness Princess Samaya. I don't think I have seen ever so many young people at such a conference. It really seems to me that I feel somewhat there is an investment also of the younger generation. So in response to your question, yes, I think it would still be vital to have an organization like UNESCO.
Professor Zerbo, a similar... a similar but slightly different form of this question for you. CTBTO is obviously going through a period now when the expansion of nuclear arms seems to be something that people are at least talking about. What is the role of scientists in at least trying to inform the process to keep things going, even as maybe the global political environment is not as robust as it was maybe 15 years ago for this?
Thank you, Vo. I wanted to go back to your question about, for instance, if the CTBT didn't exist, will we create the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty today? I say more than ever. If the CTBT didn't exist, we would have had to invent it today because of the tension that we see. But let's not forget that this is an endeavor of 183 countries. I'm not talking about 20, I'm not talking about 4, I'm talking about 183 countries that have gathered and signed today the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and 166 that have ratified this treaty. It is true that we have 8 countries that are basically holding hostage. It's entering into force. But because science doesn't have boundaries, the science and technology that we're using for nuclear test monitoring and for verification is what we use to create an environment in the Middle East. I want to give an example. In Jordan in 2014, we had what we call the integrated field exercise, which was a big-scale exercise to simulate what an on-site inspection will be when we verify a nuclear test explosion. Our colleague from Sesame was talking about how bringing people from different nations together. At that time, we had people from the whole Middle East in Jordan working together, talking to each other only on the science behind the technology. And that was an opportunity to exchange beside the politics and the day-to-day politics that we see. And I want to share something with you. When I reported this to a journalist, and then I said, no, I was sitting around the table with Israeli, Egyptian, Iranian, and the whole of Middle East. I mean, I got some call, and then people say, why do you say this? It's impossible. I said, but what are you talking about? This is what we face at the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty as we bring science together to build what is necessary and then give the tools for the policymakers to make a decision. And this is what we try to do. What I want to say as well is the young people that we're involving today, the youth group of the CTBT. I mean, there's no youth, I mean, they have no differences. What they want is what they believe in, what they've learned, and how they can portray this to the rest of the world the best way possible to advocate for something that is meaningful to them. And this is what we're trying today, to get young people to take this issue forward. We've done our part. We're putting the seeds, but those who will witness a world free of nuclear weapons are the young people today. And they're the leaders today because of social media. They're the leaders today because they know more than we share with them. And that's why if we don't involve them, we won't be able to move forward on global issues that we're dealing with. And we have 90 countries that host international monitoring facilities. If I take the case of India and Pakistan, they're not signatory of the CTBT, but through our science and technology series of conferences, we bring scientists from India and Pakistan to work with that, which the treaty doesn't provide. The treaty doesn't allow non-signatory states to be part of our work. But science and technology has enabled us to bring Indian, Pakistanis, people from Cuba to work with us on developing the technology for nuclear test monitoring. And this is what we do on a daily basis at the CTBT. Thank you.
Thank you. Pavel, yours is a different organization. We've now heard 195, 183, 100. Yours is an organization which is 20s or
25.
25,
yeah.
24. And it was actually, in many ways, founded not only in spite of, but maybe even because of a national competition. How has the current environment of increasing perceptions of nationalism changed what you do, or how do you feel that that's affecting what you should be doing going forward?
Thank you for the question. Thank you for all the other comments. Well, I wouldn't hide that the trend, global trend, brings some challenges about. Let me name two. The international relations among some of the members of EASA changed over the last couple of years, specifically the last 2 years. And that requires, in the setting which we have, we are international, independent, we are like intergovernmental, but we are not intergovernmental, strictly spoken, we are in between, so it presents some challenges. The other example is even more profound. What you see over the last maybe 10 years, the fragmentation, the breakdown of the globalization trend leads to this more self-interest on the member countries. So it's increasingly more difficult to build a global benefit because there is a more tendency by the countries, by the members, to prefer their own national benefit. This is one of the challenges I think we all share probably across this panel. However, strangely enough, the new fragmentation, political one, nationalism, etc., also brings many new opportunities to EASA. We are being called into the situation where it is beyond imagination, somebody else will be called into. Let me give you 2 examples. Migration crisis in Europe, as we call it. It surprised almost every institution, and same commissioner who left the room here together with others called on EASA together with GRC to put together quickly the worst center of excellence for migration studies, which we are now currently conducting, to look into the science behind this particular issue in a very inclusive way. I just came back 2 weeks ago from Arctic Summit in Reykjavik, where President Grimson of Iceland asked EASA to step in there where the Arctic nations cannot deal with the issues which are too political in terms of the Arctic futures, combining the economic interest and the environmental interest and interest of, for example, fisheries, which were kept by political agreement outside of the Arctic Council agenda. At the moment when the Crimea crisis was peaking, 2014, I was hosting at EASA 40 top economists from Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, EU28, as a part of the project which was commissioned to us jointly by the European Commission and President Putin administration. And we spent 3 fantastic days of thinking about economic integration in future. These are the moments where I believe that the new fragmentation brings new challenges and opportunities to institutions like mine, like CERN, like Sesame. Thank you.
No, thank you. And Jihan, I want to follow up with a little bit a similar vein of questioning, but maybe a slightly different given your own sort of circumstance. The idea of national rivalry is not new, and even maybe even sometimes more focus on the national focus is not there. So a slightly different question. What keeps you up at night more? A worry about an experiment or a worry about a political situation for the member states?
Oh, that was very difficult questions. So I think according to the situation that we have now, I would say that the political situations are not new for us. It's like loops, war and peace and war and peace and war and peace. And we're looking for something new. So I would worry more about my experiments more than what's happening on the political field, because essentially I'm also a scientist and I do my business and I leave others to do their business. And I think if everyone applies the same principle and everyone tries to be the best in his own or her own field, we would help more our societies, more than worrying about a political situation that probably will never, ever be changed. So I think we should tackle the points that there is hope in them, and the points that we feel that we are introducing a change, a real change in our societies, more than watching TVs and reading newspapers about what's happening around. So I care about the microscope and the tissues and the cells and the samples.
I had anticipated that. I appreciate one of the things that I think is a problem, and having been around science diplomacy now for years, is it is sometimes a risk if we forget that there's science. And the
Exactly.
science has to drive it.
Exactly.
And so hearing that from
It's
you is
it's
just
the main pushing reason for us at Sesame, not the politics and not the diplomacy, science. That's it.
Wonderful, thank you. And Peter, you again articulated 3 different forms of science diplomacy, and they come in at the different scales. Your country has just gone through an election. We've obviously talked a lot about other countries have gone through elections. How does that affect, or where we are in the world, affect where the emphasis is within that spectrum?
Well, I think that obviously we need to always convince changers and politicians of the value of the different layers of evidence into policy, of science into diplomacy, and that's a matter of good explanation, good narrative, and good examples. And we have 6 good examples in this podium. There are many examples, and it is very easy, in my judgment, to explain to a politician that national interest is promoted by global interest, and that you can relate the two. And if you think, you asked of Flavia and I think the others, could you invent your organization now? UNESCO grew out of a crisis of the Second World War, but in 2015, we may not have had a crisis, but we had a new framing of the world's agenda through Sendai, through Paris, and particularly through the global goals at the SDGs. And every country in the world has signed up to those global goals as both global goals and national goals. So I think we do have a framing in which, irrespective of the political ideology of a government of the day, we can push the argument for why there is a national interest in working together using science, because there's not one of those global goals that does not need science at the heart of it. You cannot face the Sendai Agreement, you cannot face the Paris Agreement, you certainly can't face any of those 169 targets in the SDGs without science. And I think a great event happened this year, which we don't know, which is not understood yet. The merger of ISSC and ICSU is a sign that we are recognizing the importance of interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. You've raised the issue of nationalism, several of you have. One of the ways we're going to address nationalism is by using transdisciplinary science to explain to both society and to politicians that there is common interest. So I think that we have a new framing here in which science diplomacy at multiple levels has an enormous capacity to advance the world.
So I'm just going to say go.
Thanks, Vaughan. Well, I'm pleased that Peter's mentioned the merger, which I won't go into the details of, except to say that it reflects the realization that whatever problem you may choose to frame, it cannot be comprehensively addressed through the lens only of the natural sciences or the physical sciences. We need the social sciences, behavioral, economic sciences, and this has been one of the major factors behind the merger of ICSU and the International Social Science Council to form the International Science Council. There'll be further news about that in the weeks and months to come. But Vaughan, I wanted to, in a sense, just continue where Peter left off with regard to your question broadly framed in terms of growing nationalism, nativism, populism, and the like, and reflect on what we should be doing with regard to the broad citizenry, that is beyond governments and the like. Come back to the IAP's goal, or one of its chief goals, that is of working towards a scientifically literate global citizenry. So what do we do with regard to climate change, with regard to vaccination, any of these issues around which one finds that, ideologically and otherwise, one finds anti-intellectualism and anti-science stance more or less going hand in hand with populism. I've got to say that we have some wonderful examples of work that academies and networks of academies have done precisely to address these problems to ensure that the broad public develops a good understanding of what is it that underlies the position with regard to climate change or with regard to vaccination. What really is the evidence? What are the details and the like? And I think that there we have a major role to play because, you know, populism is not an isolated phenomenon in the contemporary world. One doesn't know where it's all going. We have a really important role to play, not only with regard to governments, policymakers, but with regard to the broad public.
Thank you. I'm cognizant right now that we are getting towards the end of our time and we have a hard stop. So I do want to provide the opportunity for, and moving actually down the line in order, the opportunity for each one of the experts and the panelists to reflect on either one or the other question. So it's one or the other. The first one would be, if you could recommend one action for this region to increase participation in science diplomacy, what would that be? And so that one. But the other one is what I've noticed here among this panel is just a lot of interactions and synergies and lessons learned actually for each other. And since you can only pick one of those to address, the question would be either what would you think about for this region in science diplomacy and how to think about that going forward, or directed towards one of your colleagues, something from your own experience, from what you've heard them saying that might help them think about science diplomacy.
Well, thank you. You know, listening to my colleagues and following what we've done during this week at the World Science Forum here, there's something that is missing. I think we have many institutions, many international organizations or regional organizations. But we talk about science and diplomacy. I see hope in science diplomacy whereby it might cross the boundaries between not only international organizations, because we haven't talked about that. International organizations, we seem to be working in silos. I think everyone comes with his expertise. Depending on expert in the organization, they may collaborate, they may go into technical or scientific partnership, and then we stop it when decision-making comes. So I see in science diplomacy a way to allow international organizations to cooperate more, and then to lead some of the findings that they have into policy decisions that will allow more collaboration regionally and then globally. There are many institutions, I think we're coming from different institutions, but I'm sure that if we dig into it, we'll find some redundancy in what we do for the international community. I think there's an opportunity to work together to see what we can bring as synergies and to integrate what we do scientifically in order to give in a cost-effective manner to the international community and to our stakeholders the best way possible. I think that's lacking. And those who bridge that gap are fora like the World Forum, the World Science Forum, or initiative like Science and Diplomacy, where you cross against those frontiers where national interest is governed by what my country will get into this. I think this is what I see in the discussion we had today. Thank you.
Thank you. Flavia.
Well, I would just like to raise two words, communication and trust. I think when I look at now also a few years of experience in science diplomacy, I mean, we really try to bridge a few hurdles among scientists, between scientists and decision makers, between scientists and decision makers and broader public. So it seems to me communication is really key. Do we also, as an organization, for example, as UNESCO, I mean, yes, we're using now also Twitter and we're on Facebook and all that, but are we really adapting the way we communicate to the people out there? Can we really bring in also the voices, for example, of indigenous peoples into that whole arena? Because, I mean, there are also other knowledges out there than just the science, which I think have to come into, because as we always say that we should also have this other 50% of the brains, which are the women, in this debate. I think we should have actually all the knowledges which we have out there into looking into solutions. And the other one is really about trust. I mean, I think it's like in a relation or when you're married or not, but just together over a longer period of time. I mean, the diplomacy is not something you start when you have a crisis, really. Ideally, you have started before when it was more or less smooth and you build trust and you have a long-term conversation among the scientists, among the politicians, so you're ready actually to accept a crisis or a disaster or so, and might find a way together because you had built trust together. So I really think also looking at this World Science Forum, it seems to me it has really created a culture of communication among each other, among different stakeholders, and I think it has conveyed a sense of trust. And I think that Her Royal Highness Princess Amaya mentioned it today at the press conference, that all member states of ESCWA, all these Arab countries are represented here. I think this is really also a very positive sign of the power of science, of building trust through talking about these topics as we have addressed them today. Communication and trust.
I'll be brief, Vaughan. 2 points I'd like to make. I've been greatly impressed to learn more about the extent of regional cooperation in this part of the world. I spoke earlier about the importance of the regional networks in the IAP, the regional offices in ICSU. I think that it's absolutely vital that we consider how best the Middle East region be better, if you like, represented in these organizations. One may argue that it's part of Asia or that the North Africa part is part of Africa. I don't think that that is an adequate response. I think that it is really important to broaden the networking and the mobilizing ability and the like by considering how best the MENA region be integrated into the work of these organizations. And the second very brief point I'd like to make concerns the drive and energy of young people. So we have a number of young people at this meeting, as has been noted earlier. In addition, we've had some wonderful interventions from members of the Global Young Academy. There's a Global Young Academy, and there are a number of national young academies. It's absolutely vital that they also become integrated into the work of these organizations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'll be super brief too. So I'll send quick 3 messages to the people of my region. The first one is that in order for others to believe in what we are doing, we have first to believe in ourselves. We have to believe that we can compete and we can do like others. We have to be confident. The second message is to trust each other. I stress again on what Flavia said. Trust and trust and trust. And we don't have to be afraid of each other exactly as we are here. I don't think that any one of us is afraid of the others. The third, that we really need to be more realistic and we need to be more clever and to change our perspectives for once in our lives. We need to be realistic and to think smarter. I would end with just this. I picked it from the hall out there. Certain people for peace. And allow me to read the sentence that is written behind. It's written, at the lowest point on earth, the only way is up. So we really need to follow this simple advice to keep going forward. Thank you.
On the first question, one about region and science diplomacy. Let me share with you my dream to this question. Currently, IASA is privileged to have Iran as a member, Egypt as a member. Israel is joining us within the next 2 weeks. Others are discussing with us. I'm going to sign an agreement tonight with Royal Highness Sumaya based on the Royal Society of Region and IASA about collaboration. My deep respect and thanks to the leadership this country has provided to dialogue in the region goes beyond any border. My dream is as follows. With those countries which joined us here, with others like Palestine, who may join the project. We start here within the next 2 years, 3 years, first ever collaborative project, led by EASA, done through Jordan on the futures of the region. It should be Agenda 2030 futures, to see how this could look like with the scientific support. So this is my dream and my hope for the region, expectation from the region too. And what I am taking home from here, what I learned, many things, but one is most important, the emotion which my colleagues talks about, Sesame, the belief she has. I'm going to learn from it and do the same job for EASA. Thank you.
Peter.
The 2030 agenda requires science and it requires diplomacy, and it requires science diplomacy. To get there, we have a major deficit. Only 15 of the countries of the world have science advice formally linked to their foreign ministries. And as a starting point, we need diplomats and scientists to be better linked within their own countries. Secondly, we have a major deficit because there is no linkage between the UN system and national science advisory systems. And at the end of the day, it's national governments in most situations that determine policy actions. And therefore, the failure of the UN to have an integrated science advisory mechanism, which in turn is linked to national advisory mechanisms, is going to be a fundamental limit on the ability of us to reach the 2030 goals. In 4 hours' time, when New Zealand wakes up, the manifesto, we have that last slide, of the International Network of Government Science Advice on how to reach the 2030 goals will be up for final consultation, the final draft. We would want everybody to look at it and comment on it because it specifically requests that the UN looks to re-establish an appropriate advisory mechanism which looks to link national and international science advisory mechanisms to advance the 2030 agenda. Thank you very much. Here's the website. 4 hours from now, it will be active.
Thank you. And I want to take one last chance to thank this panel for being extremely timely and very substantive. And I want to apologize to the audience for not getting a chance to go to questions. Our panel time was a little bit shorter. But I really do want to end by saying that this is a place that we all came together 3, 4, 5 days ago as an opportunity to run an experiment. Could you have a World Science Forum in the Middle East that would draw together the top scientists, not only from the usual places that they come together from, but from all the places? And as with every experiment, you learn lessons, but you also come away from the laboratory with a great big smile on our faces, knowing that there's another experiment to run someplace else, and we'll learn from this and go forward. So thank you so much to my panelists. Thank you so much to the World Science Forum. Thank you so much to the country, the magnificent country of Jordan. And thank you so much to Her Royal Highness for pulling this together. And thank you very much to the Hungarians for being remarkable organizers over many, many years to help bring this together, and all the participants and all the sponsors. Thank you so much.
لأننا نؤمن في مؤسسة عبد الحميد شومان بأهمية الابتكار والإبداع في تلبية احتياجاتنا وإيجاد حلول عملية للتحديات التي تواجهها مجتمعاتنا، ارتأت المؤسسة إطلاق جائزة عبد الحميد شومان للابتكار بشقيها العلمي والمجتمعي، والتي تركز على الحقول التالية: التكنولوجيا الخضراء والاستدامة البيئية، الأمن الغذائي والتكنولوجيا الزراعية، الرعاية الصحية والتكنولوجيا الطبية، سوق العمل وحلول الإنتاجية الاقتصادية، وحلول تعلمية. وسيكون باب التقدم للجائزة مفتوحاً اعتباراً من العام 2018 وبموازنة تصل لغاية $1,000,000 أردني.